Hey everyone, today I'm going to go over raid buff and debuff changes in Cata Classic. With 10 main raids being more important in Cata, there are tons of changes to raid buffs and debuffs to make it easier for a 10-man group to bring everything. There are no longer improved versions of the same buff type, so you don't have to worry about someone being spec'd a certain way to bring the best version of the buff. There's just one version of these buffs. Let's first look at changes to raid buffs. The 5% stats buff type is a combination of the previous versions of Mark of the Wild and Blessing of Kings. It still gives a small amount of resistance to all elements. This buff is brought by paladins, druids, and BM hunters with a shale spider pet. The strength and agility buff type has had battle shout added to it, since the static attack power buff type no longer exists. This buff is brought by warriors, DKs, shamans, and hunter cat pets. The 20% attack power buff type replaces the old 10% attack power buff type. Blessing of Might has been added to this buff type since the static attack power buff type no longer exists. This buff is brought by Blood DKs, Enhancement Shamans, Marksmanship Hunters, and Paladins. The old 20% attack speed buff type has been changed to 10% attack speed. It can be brought by Shamans, Frost DKs, and Survival Hunters. Bloodlust can now be brought by Mages and BM Hunters Corehound pet in addition to Shamans. The 5% physical and spell crit buff types have been combined into just a 5% crit buff that affects both. This can be brought by Feral Druids, Fury Warriors, Elemental Shamans, Subtlety Rogues, and Hunters with a Wolf or Devil Sword pet. And now 5% Spell Haste is the only haste buff type. This can be brought by Boomkins, Shao Priests, or Shamans. The 10% spell power buff type replaces the old static spell power buff type. This is brought by Demolocks or Ellie Shamans. There's also a 6% spell power buff that does not stack with the 10% one, and is brought by Mages and Shamans. The static intellect buff type no longer exists and has become the increased mana buff type. This is brought by Mages and Warlocks through a Fell Hunter pet. The increased health buff type no longer exists, and Commanding Shout and Blood Pact have been changed to the stamina buff type. The mana per 5 buff type can be brought by Shamans, Fell Hunters, and Paladins. It's worth noting that the mana per 5 that used to be from Blessing of Wisdom is now baked into Blessing of Might, since Blessing of Wisdom no longer exists. The mana replenishment buff type can be brought by Shadow Priests, Resto Druids, Destrolocks, Frost Mages, and Ret Pallies. The old version of Revitalize no longer exists, and it was changed to mana replenishment. Some buff types that no longer exist and don't have replacements are Spirit, Healing, and 3% damage reduction. The 30% bleed damage debuff can be brought by Feral Druids, Arms Warriors, Subtlety Rogues, and Hunters with a Silithid, Rhino, Boar, or Ravager pet. The 4% physical damage debuff can be brought by Combat Rogues, Frost DKs, Arms Warriors, or Hunters with a Worm or Ravager pet. The 5% spell crit debuff can be brought by Fire Mage or Destrolock. The 8% spell damage debuff replaces the old 13% spell damage debuff and can be brought by Assassination Rogue, Lock, Unholy DK, Boomkin, or a Hunter with a Dragonhawk or Wind Serpent pet. The 3% crit and hit debuffs no longer exist. The 12% armor debuff replaces the 20% armor debuff and can be brought by Warriors, Druids, Rogues, and Hunters with a Raptor or Serpent pet. The old 5% armor debuff no longer exists. The 20% attack speed debuff can be brought by Warriors, DKs, Prop Eyes, Feral Druids, and Hunters with a Tall Strider pet. The 10% physical damage debuff replaces the old attack power debuff and can be brought by Warriors, Druids, Prop Eyes, and Blood DKs. 25% and 10% reduced healing debuffs replace the old 50% and 20% reduced healing debuffs. They do not stack, but the 25% debuff can be brought by Rogues, Arms/Fury Warriors, Hunters, and Devil Sword pets. The 10% debuff can be brought by Frost Mages and Shadow Priests. Judgment of Light and Wisdom debuffs for health and mana restore no longer exist. That should cover the main changes you'll see for raid buffs and debuffs in Cata. If you'd like to support me, you can help me out by liking, commenting, and subscribing. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.